Hello to the Art of World Building podcast, episode number 15, part 1. Today we discuss how to create a settlement. This includes the impact of location, population, zoning, its history, and any secrets it holds. This material and more is discussed in Chapter 6 of Creating Places, Volume 2 in the Art of World Building book series. Do you want practical advice on how to build better worlds faster and have more fun doing it? The Art of World Building book series, website, blog, and podcast will make your worlds beat the competition. This is your host, Randy Ellefson, and I have 30 years of world building advice, tips, and tricks to share. Follow along now at artofworldbuilding.com. One of the most important aspects of any settlement is its location because that determines so many things about what happens there. This includes the reason it exists on that spot to what it has to defend itself against, the climate, species, culture, and a lot more. So we're going to start with this. First, we'll talk about climate, and we'll only touch on this briefly because we already did a whole episode about this earlier. Today, we just want to talk about how this affects our settlement. Climate is a consistent weather pattern over a long period of time, and it affects the amount of rainfall, the temperature, and the air quality. Since the climate generally stays the same in a place for thousands of years, any city built there is going to experience that climate for a long time and adjust to that climate. This not only affects the people there and the culture that develops, but it also affects the plants and the animals who live there or nearby, and that in turn affects the livestock and anything else that's available for the people who live there. A simple example of this is that some climates cause a desert to form and other climates cause a rainforest, and these are basically the opposite of each other when it comes to rain and how much livestock and plant life is found there. That's an especially dramatic example, but less dramatic versions of this happen, such as one area of the United States is known for being really humid and hot, but another area of it is known for being really hot but dry. And the result is that people think of these places different ways, even if they don't live there, just because they've heard of what life is like there. They hear about it because it's important to the people who live there, and it has affected the way they live their lives. For example, in the hot and humid area, people probably don't spend quite as much time outdoors during the summer. We could think of many examples of this, but you can really just base things on analogs, something from Earth. One of the great things about deciding our climate is that if we have a map, for example, and we've already decided where our city is located, our map may have already basically told us what the climate there is. In that sense, the work is done for us. Now, if we don't have a map, we may want to choose a city that we are familiar with, or at least one that we've heard about, and choose to use that as the basis as far as the climate goes, and then research that city on the internet and see what life is like there as far as how that climate affects people. When we first go to create a settlement, all we really need is a high-level idea of what it is like, such as humid or dry, rainy or arid, hot or cold. More details than that are something that we can add later. Also bear in mind that the terrain can affect the climate, because if we have a city that is very high in the mountains, for example, the climate is going to be different there than we might expect given the latitude where it is found. This is also something that we discussed in a previous episode. This is a good segue into talking about terrain, so let's focus on that. If our settlement is located in the mountains, those mountains are going to inhibit travel to and from that settlement over land. If we have a science fiction setting or even a fantasy one where there are a lot of giant birds of prey or dragons or something similar that flies, some of this could be mitigated. Keep this level of technology in mind when you are laying out a mountainous settlement, because depending on how much ability there is to go over walls and over the terrain, this will impact the kind of fortifications that they have, and that's something that we'll talk a little more about in the next episode. What you want to do in the beginning is get a feel for how well visited is this place. Do they seldom see travelers, or are travelers coming there all the time anyway? Decide how easy it is for people to get there. Also consider how technology has changed. It might be that in the past, there wasn't technology that allowed people to easily get there, and as a result, there weren't too much in the way of walls, but now it is easy for people to get there via the air, and there still aren't too many reasons for walls, but maybe they have other fortifications instead. Part of what we're getting at here is that there might be fortifications that are old and in disrepair because they no longer apply, such as a wall that used to keep people out, but now technology has rendered that wall meaningless, but no one took the time to knock it down, so it's still standing. Maybe sections of it have fallen down and no one has done anything about it. This is the kind of thing that we can use to characterize the age of a place as people are arriving, or if we're just setting our entire story there. Another thing to keep in mind with mountains is that this will really limit where any farmland is and might inhibit it altogether depending on how rugged that terrain is. Keep in mind that mountain ranges typically have valleys, and those may be wide enough and fertile enough for farmland. However, this does restrict them to that particular valley, and as a result there is some vulnerability to someone burning down the crops or just predators knowing that our species are there and they can be attacked because they're working the land at times. A mountainous settlement is also likely one to have a certain amount of involvement in mining. This is going to help us think of some potential products that they might have in the form of gemstones or other materials that they have pulled out of the earth. The settlement might even be rich because of this. Maybe they have big walls after all. Bear in mind that any settlement might be adjacent to more than one terrain. So for example, with a desert city, we don't have to decide that it's entirely in the desert. We could just have the desert be off to one side. Now, there's not going to be a lush forest right next to a desert because if you've been paying attention to these episodes, that's not typically the way climate works, unless something like magic is at play. We could also use technology because certainly in our modern times we have turned entire deserts into something that's got enough vegetation for people to live. In a futuristic society, we could certainly do the same. The real point I'm getting at here is that by having more than one terrain type near our settlement, we can make use of more than one. This gives us the best of both worlds and potentially the worst of both worlds. You may recall from a previous episode that not all deserts are actually sandy, many of them are hard, but let's say for the sake of argument that we have a sandy desert to one side. It's unlikely that an army is going to choose to approach from that direction. On the other hand, if there are grasslands in the other direction, that's probably the way they're going to come. This may have an impact on the internal layout of our city, not to mention the fortifications. Another settlement type that might be near but not surrounding our settlement is a forest. Fortifications is one of the basic reasons for this because a forest can hide an approaching army. It's fairly standard for the inhabitants of that settlement to cut down the trees within a certain distance around the settlement, such as a mile or two. So even if our settlement is inside the forest completely, there's still going to be that cleared area around it. But we may want to just decide to put our settlement adjacent to that forest. One great thing about a forest is that the trees and the other plants there provide a great number of products that our people are going to use for one thing or another, such as building ships. There's more mundane stuff that they can do with it, but I think the presence of wooden ships in a fantasy setting is something that's pretty important. This can greatly expand how far people can go, but the absence of those will also restrict them from going anywhere. This is something to keep in mind. Just as with mountains, we need to figure out how often is this place visited, or how often do people travel away from here to other places. We need to do this with other settlements, whether or not they have a forest and access to water, whether that's the ocean, a lake, or even a river. A water source is another thing that's really important, not only for the ability to drink it, but because of these travel opportunities. Anywhere that's located on a coastline, such as the ocean or a large lake, is going to be visited and also have the ability to travel, assuming that there is a forest nearby for them to create ships from. Some of these settlements near the water might also have other dangers that they face, just like in the mountains we might have something that's living underground and that comes out from time to time. Near a large water source, we could of course have sea monsters. We may have also chosen to invent species that are water-dwelling and which are sentient and therefore can interact with our species. So by knowing that these exist and deciding where our settlement is, we can decide whether that species is well known there or not. Bear in mind that there are underground rivers, and these could allow a species that is water-dwelling to get much further inland than we might expect them to. There are a lot of products that come from the sea, and I'm not just talking about food. This could be anything like candle wax from whales to any product that we invent. Another subject we should think about is whether the terrain is impacting the layout of our city. This is something that's certainly going to happen in the mountains because if there's a giant area of hard ground, we just aren't going to be building anything on that. We may want to decide that there's a large outcropping of rock that's in the middle of a settlement and that it acts as some sort of gathering place for people. It could also be a convenient lookout point when people climb it, or it could also be used for games such as those by adolescents. Higher areas are typically used for defense, such as a castle being built there. Sometimes this is also where wealthier people will live. Water is generally considered to be more advantageous than not having the water, and I don't mean on the grand scale, but just that the wealthy people will be those more likely to live near a river, for example. This isn't always true because it will depend on the river and other factors, but it's something to keep in mind as an option. On the other hand, the port area of a town is going to be a little more run down in many cases, but it will depend on the settlement and what you want to do. In a fantasy world, it is often shown that a port is somewhere where nefarious people are more likely to gather, such as pickpockets and those without a job. On the other hand, in certain modern ports here on Earth, we have very nice ports where they've been turned into a tourist destination. Bear in mind that something like a river can act like a natural moat, preventing or inhibiting an army from attacking from that side, and obviously a big body of water is going to have the same effect, unless of course they are attacking from wooden ships. Well, in a fantasy setting they will be wooden, but of course they don't have to be. Generally, you want to figure out how the terrain has impacted the layout of your city. Where's the river or lake? Where are the higher areas? Is there something that must be built around, and what is it? Is it a swampy area, or is it a giant boulder? Variation is good. If you're looking for more world-building resources, artofworldbuilding.com has most of what you need. This includes more podcasts like this one, and free transcripts if you'd prefer to read an episode. You can also find more information on all 3 volumes of the Art of World-Building series, which is available in ebook, print, and audiobook formats. Much of the content of those books is available on the website for free. You can also join the mailing list at artofworldbuilding.com/newsletter. This gets you free, reusable templates from each published volume in the series. You don't even need to buy the books to get these. I also send out contest information, free tips, and other stuff to help with your efforts. Please note that I do not share your email address with anyone because that's against my privacy policy, and you can unsubscribe at any time. Sign up today to get your free content and take your world building to the next level. We should also consider where the water supply is, and remember that seawater cannot be consumed by humans at least because the salt will make us sick. Our basic options are a river, lake, spring, or well. In a more modern or futuristic society, we could have giant stations that are basically turning seawater into something that is drinkable, because that is possible even today. That process is called desalinization. When laying out our settlement, it helps to know where that water supply is. If we have a settlement that is a large town or even bigger, such as a city, then there's probably going to be an area that's called Old Town or something similar, and Old Town is definitely going to have its own water source. After all, that's where people started building this place. Just like we were talking about with ports, Old Town can sometimes be a rundown area that is not much traveled, or it can be a tourist destination that is well kept. As you build many settlements across one world or multiple worlds, try to vary this. Regardless, Old Town tends to be a place with narrower streets and where the buildings are kind of crowded in close upon each other. So decide if there is an Old Town and where it's located and what it's like. We should also think about who the neighbors are. This can include sovereign powers. After all, our settlement is either deep within a sovereign power, near the edge of its power, or in a land without a power ruling it. If it's deep within a territory, it's not going to be reached very quickly by an invading army. This means it might enjoy more peace of mind and therefore have less expectations of war. In fact, the population there could be rather skeptical of ever being attacked. They might be complacent. This does depend on the strength of the sovereign power to whom it belongs, because if it's a new power or one that is actually failing in some way due to something like famine or just poor government, then that kind of weakness can invite another sovereign power to attack. It's also possible that the settlement is now deep within a territory, but that sometime in its past it was closer towards the border. This is another scenario where it might have walls for fortifications, but those are not necessarily being kept that well anymore. Maybe the guards who are on those walls are just doing a kind of duty where they don't expect any actual fighting. If the settlement has been near the border of a sovereign power, that means it might have been attacked repeatedly over the course of its history by another sovereign power's cities. If it's currently near a border, then that means it's probably built up a little bit more when it comes to military and fortifications, and it might even have people who specialize in certain kinds of fighting, such as if we have a kind of species that is known to live in that neighboring sovereign power, we might have people who are good at fighting that. During either times of peace or war, it's possible that people could come to this settlement for training, and that could be something that we make our settlement known for. This is one way in which the neighbors can help build up our city. So one of the things we need to decide is where inside our sovereign power is this settlement, and how long has it been there. If it was part of another sovereign power, and that has a very different culture, we can also then figure out what cultural elements from that other sovereign power have impacted this one. Another option we have is a city or city-state that is not part of a sovereign power. Some such places might be very strong, but others could be very vulnerable. Decide if this place needs allies and whether or not it has them, and from where. That will determine how quickly someone can come to their aid. It's also possible that one of its ally cities is the one that has been captured recently by another sovereign power and now cannot come to its aid. Many places will have been conquered at some time in their paths, so it helps to figure out how long ago this last happened, how often it happens, and how did it end. Is this settlement recently captured, or was that a long time ago and it's at peace with being part of whatever sovereign power it now is part of? Or is this settlement a little bit restless as far as the population and they would like to have their freedom back, but they don't think there is anything they can do? Maybe everyone is just biding their time. For any settlement that's within a sovereign power, we can generally assume that other settlements within that sovereign power are basically friendly toward it. However, this may not be true if they were once adversaries, or at least recently so, especially if there's another nearby settlement that has only been recently conquered by the sovereign power to which our current settlement belongs. One thing I'm getting at here is trying to create a little bit of history for our settlement. We don't have to explain history, but we can show it in various ways, such as architecture that came from another sovereign power that is no longer ruling this place. Our characters may be well aware of such a thing, and we could have them walking down the street and see some building that they despise because of that association, and maybe they think about this as they're going along. We'll only want to do this if it impacts the scene that we're telling, but there are ways to do that. For example, maybe he's about to meet another character who is from that sovereign power. I've already mentioned the idea that there could be skilled warriors here due to threats that this settlement faces, but we're also going to have skilled laborers who have one talent or another based on the kind of terrain that is nearby. For example, if the right kinds of trees are nearby, we're going to have people who are good at building ships. If there are mountains here, we might have a mining colony, and we could have people who are good at carving those stones. Think about who is here and why, and one of the reasons we can do this is that our characters are going to have some sort of history or a family business that they have originated from. Even if our character is now an adventurer, for example, and he's going to go out and do whatever adventurers do, his family probably has a business that they run or that they're at least part of. What is this guy trying to get away from? What talents that he has that he almost wishes he didn't have, but he was forced to acquire those by his parents? You can see there are ways to tie all of this together. We should also decide on a very important set of skills, and that is who are the warriors, healers, wizards, and something like fighter pilots. And do they come from this settlement or not? For those of you who support crowdfunding, I am on the patron side and would appreciate any support you can lend. It can be just $1 a month. Higher levels of support get you increasingly cool things, such as PDF transcripts, MP3s of my music, which you hear in these episodes, free ebooks and short stories, bookmarks, and even signed copies of books and CDs of my music. Many of these are unavailable to the public. Your support can help me cover the expenses of producing the show. Even better, you can help me promote it and make it more successful. Without you, there's no point in doing this. Are you benefiting from this free podcast? If so, just go to artofworldbuilding.com and click the big icon for Patron. And thank you for your support. We've already begun to discuss population, but I think there's more that we can dive into here. One of the subjects is which species are here. In fantasy in particular, there's a tendency to present one city as being all human, another as all dwarven, another as elven, but there isn't too much of a mix being shown. This seems like an oversight, and it is usually justified by saying that each one of these species has some sort of attitude about the others. While that is true, it's a bit of a cliche, and it might be more interesting to have more of a melting pot going on. Now, some people might automatically assume that if there is a melting pot that people are getting along so much better and that we have eliminated some source of conflict. But if you put people together, there can actually be more conflict. And if we look at a country like the United States, we are one of the biggest melting pots in the world, and we certainly have all sorts of racial conflict here. In science fiction, it seems to be more common that we have a mix, and this might be because we are typically showing places where so many different planets and cultures within those planets have the ability to travel through space, and they end up mingling much more. Regardless of how big a melting pot concept we decide to do, one of the species is still going to be a majority. We should decide who that is, and when we're trying to figure out which other species live here and in what percentages, we should consider those land features we already talked about. I'm going to use fantasy as an example because it's a little more consistent with the races that are there, but if you have mountains nearby, then you're going to have dwarves as part of this settlement. The same is true with forests and elves. Some of these land features might be close enough that we see these species all the time. Maybe not that many of them live here, but quite a few of them would, and they would certainly be frequent visitors. And if they're all part of the same sovereign power, then in theory they get along. By get along, I mean that they are not starting wars with each other. They might still have bar fights, but that's kind of not the same thing. Now, whether we use the standard fantasy races or make up our own, we might want to decide that they are not so stuck on this idea that the dwarves only live in their mountains and they don't venture out except for adventures or short periods. And the same with elves. Why not have them be people who are willing to form a joint settlement with other species? This gives us another variety, and variety is good. We can have different things going on in different parts of the world. Maybe there's a forest with elves who are very opposed to outsiders and they keep to themselves, like the stereotype, but then maybe we have another forest full of a different elven population that is much more gregarious and outgoing. There's also work that people can have. So, for example, dwarves are supposed to be really good at cutting through stone, so wouldn't they be in high demand in a city that is somewhere else and that skill is needed? Maybe by dwarven standards, this character is not considered really good and therefore he's been denied the right to do this for a living, so he leaves and he goes to a mostly human settlement and there he's considered some sort of amazing expert, even though back home he's not. We can find ways like this to make our species more intermingled. If we have something like a monarchy, a kingdom, we could have this situation where only the humans are allowed to be part of the royal family and therefore in the ruling class. But what about a democracy? That form of government is supposed to be by the people and for the people. And if we have a significant population of our different species living here, then shouldn't they be represented in that government? In that case, you would have a situation where someone like an elf could be elected in a human settlement. Now, maybe it won't happen due to politics and all of that, but, it should be possible, at least in theory. Another thing to keep in mind is that forms of government change. So we could have had a form of government at one point, and as, let's say, 100 years passed, more and more elves are becoming part of the population. And then that government type falls and is replaced by, let's say, a democracy. And now the elves are a significant percentage, and they manage to acquire more power than they once had. This is a believable scenario because populations of any city or a sovereign power slowly change over time. I can tell that I have sovereign powers on my mind because some of what I was saying kind of applies a little bit more to that than to settlements, but of course I just did 3 episodes on sovereign powers. Regardless, the idea still holds true. We should have a population that is a little bit more mixed in at least some of the settlements that we create. We can certainly have restaurants that cater to certain populations. Here in the United States, we have Japanese restaurants, Chinese, all this other stuff. Why not have the same thing where you have elven restaurants and dwarven restaurants? Why can't we have a situation where a human character really likes elven food and goes to eat at the elven restaurant all the time? Maybe he's on friendly terms with the elves and that this was how that got started. Maybe another character hates elves and refuses to eat such food. Something I'm not going to cover here too much are who the leaders of this settlement really are. This detail and a bunch of other stuff is covered a lot more in Creating Places. But one of the things that is discussed there is who the leader is and what the power structure is among that leader and the other people who are responsible for running the town. This is something that our characters need to know because if they are traveling and they arrive in this settlement, they need to know who they're dealing with and how much power that person really has. In our modern world, we tend to ignore that sort of thing, but there are certainly people who pay more attention to it. And I think in a more fantasy-like setting where people are traveling and there is not so much of a homogeneous country where so many things are the same and these basics are taken for granted, people tend to pay more attention to what kind of power the mayor has, for example. By contrast, I don't even know who the mayor of my city is. I certainly don't know what kind of power he has because it doesn't really seem to come up or affect me in any way. I suspect that for many of you this is the same. We should also think about who has influence because there may be someone who is basically corrupting an official in some way, such as either bribery or having compromising information on that person. Our characters may arrive in this settlement and learn that a certain person has power and that they should be able to do something, but they actually can't, and they're not going to admit it because they don't want to talk about the compromise that someone has placed on them. There might also be other important people here, such as a hero or a wizard or someone from the past who has done something and has acquired a certain amount of reputation from that. There could be monuments to such a person around town. If our characters are from the settlement that we're creating, then this is something that they would be aware of. Maybe this settlement is a small village or small town and people are well aware of that's where a certain hero came from, and therefore they're curious and then maybe they're disappointed when they arrive there. It's also possible for villains to be calling this their home, and that might be openly or it might not be openly. Perhaps this is the person who has compromising information on the mayor. We should also think about the overall disposition of our population. Small towns can sometimes be romanticized as being a wonderful place that has no evil, but on the other hand, everyone knows everyone else's business. A large city is a little different in that you might never even meet someone who lives there despite living there your entire life. But there are also good things and bad things about this, such as the higher quality of goods and other merchandise just because there's so much competition. When we are creating multiple settlements, we might want to decide on a different disposition to the population for each one. We should decide on the general feel, such as whether it's dangerous or safe, whether it's kind of boring, or if it's maybe a sleepy or bustling town, or is it transient in that people are coming through there all the time, or is it the population very stable? Is it easy or hard to reach? Is it welcoming to people or not? It could be a rich settlement or a poor one. Is it artful? Is it high-minded or is it down to earth? When we're making up our mind here, we don't really need a reason to decide that it is one way versus another. But if we do want a reason, we should consider what surrounds that settlement. For example, a remote town might feel safe, stable, poorer, sleepy, and down to earth, and maybe even religious with less technology. On the other hand, a built-up city is more likely to be a little bit dangerous. It's going to be bustling. There's going to be more transience of people coming and going. It might be welcoming or indifferent to visitors and travelers, and it will be richer in some areas and poorer in others. It's also probably going to have more technology. There's another idea that I quite like, and that is a quarter. Another idea I like is the quarter. You have probably heard of the French Quarter in New Orleans. This does not mean that French people live there, but I'm going to use that basic idea. We could have a mostly human city that has an elven quarter or a dwarven quarter, and where those populations are typically found in that quarter because buildings and other things there, like the architecture and just the way things look and feel and the size, is all based on that species and caters to them. If you like this idea, decide if your settlement has such an area. If you'd like to subscribe to this free downloadable podcast, here's how to do it. For iPhone, iPad, and iPod listeners, grab your device and go to the iTunes Store. Then search for The Art of Worldbuilding. From there, download the free podcast app by Apple, and then subscribe to the show from within that app. For Android listeners, you can download the Stitcher Radio app, which is also free, and search for The Art of Worldbuilding. This only needs to be done once, because new episodes will become available in the app each time one is released, and you will never miss an episode. Another concept to be aware of is that of zoning. What this means is that residential, commercial, industrial, and agricultural zones are often created in settlements to separate things. If you've ever played a game like SimCity, you have some familiarity with this because if you create something like the garbage dump that's needed to take care of the city's waste and you put it too close to the residential areas, the game will start telling you your characters are unhappy in that area, in that residential area because they just smell the garbage all the time. So you're supposed to try to lay out your city so that there's not an overlap of certain things. This is a simple subject, but it's something that's sort of advanced in the sense that you don't really need to worry about this too much unless you are taking the time to draw a map of your settlement. Now, if you would like to sketch something that no one sees just so you can get a better sense of how things are laid out, this is a good idea. We've already talked about several areas to be aware of, such as where Old Town is, where the source of water is, if there's a river or something, if there is an area that has high ground, or if there's some sort of obstacle like a giant outcropping of rock. Another area to consider is where are these different zones. When I do this, I first think about where I would like people to live, and then I put the commercial stuff nearby and I put the industrial stuff just a little bit farther away. It's tempting to say that the wealthy people are in one area and the poorer people are in another, and that does happen, but sometimes they're mixed together. This is arguably better for conflict. The upper class might also be farther upstream because all the refuse will flow downstream towards the poorer people. This is one of the things that wealth gets you. We should also consider what secrets there might be in this town, and if those have anything to do with this physical location. We can also decide what sort of secrets our settlement has. Some of these might be based on its location. Secrets could be incorporated into this city layout that we've been talking about. For example, maybe there are catacombs or some other supernatural phenomenon that's underground, and a building has built over that location. And over the centuries, most people have forgotten that this is there, or maybe they never knew at all. If we have gods or world figures or even the undead, we can create these places that have some sort of significance. Secrets can also be a little bit more mundane, such as some sort of nasty group that is operating out of this settlement, and what comes to mind on Earth is terrorist groups. Naturally, these groups don't invent a settlement, they find one that is welcoming in some way, or at least allows them to operate. Consider what sort of secrets there might be here, and if you were to read Creating Places, Chapter 11 is called Creating Places of Interest, and it has a lot more ideas. If you're enjoying the podcast, please rate and review the show at artofworldbuilding.com/review. Reviews really are critical to encouraging more people to listen to a show they haven't heard of before, and it can also help the show rank better, allowing more people to discover it. Again, that URL is artofworldbuilding.com/review. That's going to be all for today's episode. In our next one, we will continue our discussion on how to create a settlement, and we're going to tackle a really big subject. And that's going to be the differences between a village, town, city, and megalopolis. Each of these has their own consideration and things that are possible there and things which are not. We'll also talk a little more in detail about the defense of these places, how a settlement is known, and how many places you should create. All of the show's music is actually courtesy of yours truly, as I'm also a musician. The theme song is the title track from my Some Things Are Better Left Unsaid album. But now we're closing out with another tune from the same disc. This is Pitter Patter. You can hear more at randyellefson.com. Check out artofworldbuilding.com for free templates to help with your world building. And please rate and review the show in iTunes. Thanks for listening.